I need to be more. I don't want to make this into a lecture because I'm not here to lecture you guys, and I think what would be the most interesting thing is to have a conversation about it, and I would really love for you to all participate in this, and I think I think from my side where I find this interesting is also to hear your views, and that's where really unique ideas sort of appear, right? They don't come from years of research and sort of waiting. They come from conversations like this because typically you want to hear what the next generation of students or sort of people in general think about a particular issue in the society. And I think with that, I mean, Ryan made a good introduction. I mean, I spent part of my career investing and sort of advising companies in the US, Europe, and also emerging markets. I spent a big part of my career in Eastern Europe and Africa. My first kind of really serious ventures were already done actually in that part of the world. And I think, the African continent is sort of one of the great examples where upward mobility is, badly needed. It's also a place where you could see the real difference when you give people an opportunity to succeed, and then they just do that very, very quickly. In the more developed markets, this process is much slower, and you don't see that on scale. But in a small sort of developing countries, or countries which typically underperformed historically, this is the place where upward mobility is and sort of innovation and sort of quick economic growth can be seen right away. So maybe I'll ask you this question: What do you guys? How do you define upward mobility? What do you think upward mobility is? I mean, what is it? What comes to mind? And just let's not put this. I know you like to put comments in the chat. You can unmute yourself and just go ahead. I don't see all your names, but go ahead and just
moving up the social ladder.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. Any other?
I think it's like
more opportunities.
An improvement in living standards.
It's having the opportunity and like the resources to be able to and have the chance to like earn more money than your parents or live in a higher and better neighborhood than your parents.
That's very practical. That's very practical, but that's a good way to put it.
The ability to like improve your economic or social position, I guess.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Any other way? Any other definition?
My glass is half full.
An example I would say would be the American dream in some sense, where people like from all over the world come to America just for the sense of having a better opportunity economically and socially in some sense.
Can you put someone on mute there? I think someone is not on mute. Okay. Okay, but that the last definition was also quite good. I mean, I think in a case of American dream, I guess it's a good I guess example or explanation of what upward mobility is. And any other definitions, guys? Anything else you want to add?
Escaping intergenerational poverty.
That's a really good one. Yeah, that's something that you could probably see and really compare between the generations. I think this is an important one. Yes, I agree. I think that's another way to put it.
I think, also, not just this economic aspect, because that's been mentioned a lot, but also this aspect of social status, being able to rise to a position where you're more accepted within society, where you feel like you belong more in society. So that's also an aspect.
Yeah, it's a very important one because we tend to think of upward mobility quite often as a way to make more money. But if you're in the right society, typically you should not be judged on your income or your family's income, right? And I think to me also the upward mobility is to have access to the appropriate opportunities and resources, right? Because if you look at what happens in developing countries and emerging markets and emerging countries economies, quite often a big chunk of the population does not have the access to the same resources and opportunities, right? And that's where you typically have an issue, and that's where you have, just beyond simple economic issues, you have also social issues, and that's how typically the kind of social unrest starts, and it's typically how this sort of gap tends to widen over time, because if a particular group of people doesn't have access to the right resource and opportunity, but the other group has, that gap just never kind of narrows, right? The gap only widens over time, and it happens. And I guess the point of the generation, removing the generational poverty is very important, because if that gap stays like this, it's almost impossible to narrow it and sort of remove it completely. So yeah, I mean, I think these are all good definitions. If anyone has anything else, please add.
Also, perhaps like a better safety net in terms of social support, social capital, or disposable income.
Yeah, that's a very economic way to put it. I agree. That's another, and that's typically something that a lot of kind of economists are trying to especially developed economies, trying to focus on, to make sure that people have safety net. But it also means that in certain cases, it's not just about the safety net. It's also about that the people have social security, right? And making sure that people kind of not left behind, right? So there's a very important points here. There's very economic, very pragmatic points, but they're very important. So the lecture that's been used by Socioeconomic Lab here is focused on a couple of things, and in relation to the upward mobility and innovation. This slide is sort of in the end, but I thought this was one of the most interesting slides, and I want to start with that. And so what it tells you is basically that we would quadruple our innovation rate in America if we had more women, minorities, and children from low-income families invented the same rate as high-income white men. Yeah, and this is very interesting because this innovation is typically linked really, really well and really very well correlated with sort of economic success of a country, right? And I think this is a very important point here. So, basically what it tells you is that, if you level the playing field in that innovation space, right, in an innovation rate, would change dramatically, yeah? And that would tell you that should result also in a much better society. So I think this is quite a good statement, and it's also interesting that if people, I personally, I didn't realize that it was quadruple. Yeah, I would think that it was there was correlate. It was very correlated, but I didn't think that the number is such a big number. Yeah, I see some hands here. Yeah, go ahead. See you guys raising hands.
I was just wondering, since like you talked about innovation, so should innovation, like can it be a factor of upward mobility, in a sense that like a high upward mobility area will foster people to innovate and create like this good, in a sense, fair, competitive environment?
Well, it should, right? I mean, the first thing you think about here is, how do I incentivize, and how do I make sure that these three categories that are mentioned on the slide, women, minorities, and children from low-income families, can invent at the same rate as others, right? So if you figure that out, then you should expect that, if in a particular community you figured out the way to incentivize and sort of encourage more innovation, irrespective of race, your income status or gender, then you should expect that community to very quickly move upwards, right? And I suspect that if we had that data, we can quickly prove that. If we go back to the slides here, there's much more focus and emphasis on some of the other things, and we will talk about that in a second. But what are the other questions? I see some hands here raised.
Yeah, but then I have a question about kind of the rate, because although if other people also invent at the same rate as high-income white men, then they will be able to produce like these innovative ideas. But isn't there still a limited amount of capital going around? So isn't there still going to be a similar amount of actual ideas being implemented, being fully like fleshed out, developed? Because even if some of these like low-income families, women's minorities, even if they create the ideas, wouldn't that just like take off from the actual like capital from where right now it's going to some high-income white men?
Yeah, good point. But to go around for everyone. But to your point here, what is more important is not that there is a limited pool of capital. What's more important that those who typically were not inventing are now inventing, and because they're now inventing, they have a chance to improve their particular community, right? There's a direct correlation between success in that community with so how that community is going to be performing over the coming years, right? So even if you assume that the pool of capital is the same, the innovation happens at the same rate, nothing changes. The fact that you now give a chance to someone else from that community to innovate, to create something new, will have a huge positive impact on that community. So that's where the upward mobility is sort of is really happening, right? Because for high income, typically for high income white men, right, they're already at the top level of this sort of social ladder, right, and economic ladder. That's where you kind of don't need any additional pushing there. But if you create sort of the mechanism to push the other areas, the other communities to innovate, you're basically starting to equalize the playing field here. Right? Other questions?
I guess, yeah, like I have a question, sort of. I'm a little statement, I guess, because it kind of focuses on like women and minorities inventing at the same rate as high income white men. And I guess because we don't have an actual model that that kind of projects like what would happen if that were the case. Obviously this is just theoretical, but I guess I'm more focused on like the fact that even if they were to invent at the same rate, hypothetically, especially in America, those of minorities and those like who are women, they don't necessarily get the same recognition or receive like the same prosperity, I guess, and the same like uplifting that like high income white men do. And even outside of America, in countries in places like such as Africa and like Asian nations, like it's the history of colonialism in most of those places actively prevents people from obtaining the benefit of innovation. So even if they are innovating, we don't have, I guess, like I'm a little confused because we don't necessarily, and I mean maybe I'll present it later, but like it's kind of hard to see what rate that they're innovating at already, because it's not as, I guess, elevated or boosted as innovations by people like Elon Musk, for example. So I guess for me, I'm like confused on how we're comparing it if we don't have like a certain rate of innovation rate for those communities already.
Yeah, and we'll look at the slides and we'll look at some numbers here, and the issue is it is much less, right? So that's precisely the point. So the point should be, I don't think the question should be is what do we need to do to increase the innovation amongst those groups? Yeah. So I don't necessarily think we need to worry about, because there are things that we can influence immediately, and there are things that we cannot influence immediately, right? And you always want to go for the low-hanging fruit, which is, okay, what are the things I can fix right away to improve innovation? Yeah, to improve certain communities where people who typically had little access to opportunities now have that access. So that's the low-hanging fruit that we need to focus on, right? If we really want to change society, if we really want to change certain communities, that's number one goal. I see more hands, guys. Feel free to.
Yeah, so kind of to add on to Aisha, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, her point, even if we gave women, minorities, and children these opportunities and these chances to rise and innovate, isn't it possible that they still won't rise as much as the average high-income white man, or they won't be able to take full control of those opportunities because they're women and minorities and children? Like, how would we make sure they are fully able to use these opportunities to the best of their ability?
Yeah, and I think it's a fair point, and it's really up to us now. It's up to your generation to create that sort of framework and create that ecosystem where the success is irrelevant, in terms of it's sort of independent of where you're from, what your gender is, right? What your race is. That's the the framework that we need to be creating, right? I mean, but I think it goes back to, and I think there was a valid point about the certain countries, right? There are certain countries where it is much harder for women to succeed, right? And I honestly think that it's a very difficult, and it's a very sort of it's a legacy issue in those countries, right? It's a very historic issue, and hopefully as the world moves on, sort of in the coming years, those countries will start lifting a lot of the restrictions and a lot of and creating more opportunities for people across, irrespective of the gender. But it's impossible to tackle that at every single country now, right? It's impossible to see how, for example, I mean, Africa is a good example. I don't think in Africa gender it plays a huge role. In fact, at least based on the few countries where I've worked, you can be quite successful both as a woman or as a man in a number of countries there. Okay. Now where the issue there is the real issue is there that a lot of people just don't, irrespective of the gender, they just don't have the right opportunities in front of them. Okay, guys, next.
Yeah,
I had a question.
Mine is really quick, so I'll just go quickly. It connects back to what a few other people said, how there is like disparities between like women, minorities, and children based on like race and gender from like high income families, because they grow up to having that exposure of innovation from like an early childhood standpoint. So like even if they were to catch up, wouldn't it still take a lot of years? So like, do you what would be like the most possible way for them to be able to be exposed to a more like innovative like area of origin, such that they can also have the same opportunities?
Yeah, and that's what we're gonna look at here. I mean, guys, what do you think? What do you think we need to be doing to tackle that? What is the number one thing that the first thing that we should do to tackle that issue?
I'd say education is very important to give people the foundation to start innovating, because if they don't get educated, they're not given those skills, those opportunities that are crucial.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, it's easy for me to see because both my parents are teachers. They've been teaching in Europe and in the US for over 30 years. And I saw it firsthand. I mean, the sort of education plays in my mind, number one role in both for a successful economic growth, but also for a fair society in general. And I think a lot of problems that we see in the world at the moment could be solved by educating people from, a number of regions where, we see conflicts, for example. I think education is one thing that's missing in those regions. More hands, come on, guys.
I think also just increasing awareness of opportunities that could also lead to better innovation rates and stuff like that, because if people don't know that there are certain like programs that can help them do things, and if they don't have access to certain resources to do things, they might not be able to unleash their full potential. So that would be one thing. Also just increasing awareness, and then funding certain places where like resources might be limited.
Yeah, and awareness and access to opportunities to me, this is one of the main drivers of I guess successful society, and it's linked to education. And we'll talk about this later, but it's one of the reasons why I co-founded RoundPeer, because that was the number one idea behind that platform, and it's still true to, we're still true to that mission of basically democratizing access to educational opportunities and resources. More hands?
I actually had a question really quick. So I feel like the majority of the conversation kind of focused on how innovation has the influence to improve consumer power, like consumer confidence, especially for like minorities. So my main question was, how would we like maintain uniformity like across all minorities, or like majority of the minorities? Because like obviously having opportunities is really important, but having opportunities doesn't really mean that people have adequate access to them. So like, I think someone brought up funding. So just as funding as an example, like how would all that stuff be allocated just to make sure like majority of the people are being attended?
Well, I think, to tackle that issue, first we need to tackle an issue of communities themselves, right? There are a lot of communities in the US in particular, which they're not particularly diverse, right? So the idea is, in a more sort of, if you look at the European model of cities, I mean, and I'm in Munich, for example, and you look at Munich, Berlin, it's very interesting, because here the focus of and it comes back to how the cities are structured, how the government thinks about the population. It's very rare to find. There's still, of course, there are those places where it exists in every single country, but the focus of the city planning is such that if there is for example, low-income housing, it's integrated in a relatively well-off area, for example, right? And what it means is basically the low-income families do not feel isolated. And then when it comes now to funding, each district receives the same amount of funding in the end. And each student, whether you're a high school student, middle school student, or just starting school, you're in a school that has the same amount of funding as any other school in the country. And that's how you achieve that sort of level of equality by, of course, there are still going to be families who can offer more to their kids. But to achieve, to have a good start, at least, you have to make sure that all schools are funded equally. And that's number one priority. And unfortunately, in the US, you have a lot of school districts, and through our work at RoundPeer, we've spoken with a number of districts in the US, and we know that a lot of districts have much less funding than the other districts. So that's a big issue again. But that basically comes back to your point. I mean, how do you allocate the funding? And the funding should be allocated equally, but also you should think about integrating communities, new communities, sort of diverse communities with the existing communities that's been there for generations, right? So I think if you had really sort of a proper call it diverse set of districts in the city which had the same funding, you would not have that issue. you would not think about, you know, the funding allocation because everyone have the same, right? So that's a very simple way to tackle it. You know, just providing the equal funding to every single district in you know, when it comes to education, when it comes to you know, sort of research, it's the same thing. When it comes to funding new innovation, when it comes to funding new companies, startups, that funding should be allocated equally. This should not depend on where you are, who you are. And that's the issue we see in the US with, for example, New York City and the Bay Area, right? These are two big sort of sources of, you know, funding for startups, right? They're, you know, these two cities have the most, probably the best startup venture capital ecosystem. So the founders tend to start companies in those places. Well, guess what? That's why, you know, those places have typically, you know, higher, you know, standard of living, right? But what needs to be done, you need to allocate the venture funding equally. And if you allocate the funding equally, that's a very simple way to, you know, make sure that all the communities get the same share of capital, right?
Yeah, I have a quick question, if it's possible.
Sure.
How would you separate the effect of inequality? For example, you could have inequality of opportunity that is based on merit, and inequality of opportunity that is based on race, gender, or any other factor. How would that be separated?
It's a good point, but the opportunity should not depend, the access to opportunity should not depend on anything. You know, merit is something you achieve later on, right? You know, but initially you should have the same opportunities. You know, because when you start, you know, if we talk about education, you know, you have to have sort of an equal foundation.
Oh yeah, so the talk here is about the initial point or the starting point, which shouldn't have any kind of inequality.
Yeah, and you know, if you cannot create an equal foundation, then you're not going to have an equal society no matter what. If you start with education, you start with any other social services. If you start with health, if you don't start with equal healthcare, it's going to be very, very difficult to create an equal society. I mean, that's it's been proven. I mean, I think there are a lot of broken models in a number of countries, right? Where, you know, if you don't start with the same sort of kind of rules and the same playing field for everyone, you're not going to have an equal and sort of prosperous society. It's very simple.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to cut in.
Sorry, I'm
Let's
going
go
to
one
follow
by
up.
one.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so sorry to cut in, but I was just like really interested in how we were talking about equality and how we should have like we should start with like an even playing ground to give everyone like an equal opportunity, and I totally understand that. I just like wanted to raise a really, I guess, controversial point on, like, I've been really interested in meritocracy lately, and how it can seem to be deceiving for a lot of people. So I kind of wanted to ask for your opinion on whether you believe in like the educational culture of like meritocracy, and like how each student's like approach is very individualized, how it can be like how it sometimes needs to be very individualized, and how you would like suggest to go about that. Like, would you encourage a meritocracy in education, or kind of like yeah, like a one size fits all, or like a very individualized like approach?
Yeah, look, meritocracy is a great thing when everyone had the same access to the same opportunities in the first place, right? So it's a great thing, and you know, we should find the leaders, we should find the sort of the best innovators, we should find the best technologists to drive, you know, progress, right? To drive innovation, to drive economic growth, drive new inventions, and all this. I mean, research and, you know, health, you know, medical research and all those things. So meritocracy is very important. You know, is the best way to kind of judge a person on the basis of, or a student on the basis of SAT score. Probably not. Yeah. Is GPA an important factor? It's probably an important factor, but I know a lot of people with very low GPA who are very, brilliant people. So it's definitely, it's definitely very individual. And one thing I would also encourage you to think about at this age is not to get too focused on your current achievements, because it's a very long game, right? It's a, you go through life, you're gonna finish high school, you're gonna go into college, then you're gonna start working, you're gonna do your research, you're gonna do some interesting things in life, and quite often your success only comes much later in life, or for some people it comes very early, but then you have to sort of deal with that too. So meritocracy, I think, is a wonderful thing if you can really put everyone in the same category, right? But everyone has come from different background, had different opportunities. And so to me, I think it's very difficult to, and it's why, if you look at the American higher education system, if you look at college admissions and sort of those things, that it's a very difficult process, right? I mean, you cannot find the right solution for everyone at the moment, and colleges are struggling actually. And again, through our conversations with colleges, we know that they're struggling to figure out how to fill the class, who should be accepted and who should not be accepted. How do you allocate the class based on so to make it diverse, right? All these things are very, very difficult, and I know there's colleges get a lot of blame for that as well, but they're also in a very difficult position. They're also in a position where it's almost impossible to just put everyone in the same category. And if you look, for example, at the higher education system in India or China, people just take one exam, right? And that's it. You have one exam that will define almost your whole career, academic career. And if you're for whatever reason you had a bad day, you're done. You have almost no chance of succeeding later on, right? So that to me is something that I think sort of with all the faults and flaws of the U.S. education system, you have something that sort of is sort of works, and something that is a much better system than what I've seen in other countries, for example.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to bring up a point about education. Like specifically, I think the most important part is a college degree. Like even if it's just community college, it gives you the credentials to be an innovator who can actually have their invention or innovation taken seriously. And also just things like venture capital and making more quaternary and quinary jobs more accessible to anyone with an education are important.
Yeah, traditionally, college degree is very correlated with your income, with your success in life, and there's some truth to that. I mean, but lately, people start thinking about. I mean, is the college degree really necessary to succeed in life, right? And there's been a lot of actually topics. There's been a lot of research done on that. And I think where we're moving towards is very interesting, because the traditional, very general, kind of more or less liberal education is still going to be there, but it's slowly losing its kind of appeal, right? Because with the society becoming much more reliant on technology, with the society constantly changing with the innovation, right? Having very, very generalist skills and sort of expertise when you graduate from college might put you in a category where you don't have sort of a skill that actually the employer will need. So that's one thing that we see changing now, and it's also during our conversations with colleges and with universities, both in the US and as well as in Europe. And in Europe, it's a little bit different. We see more focus on particular fields of study, more focus on very technical, very specific courses, right? So when you come out, you have quite a lot of sort of you have a very good skill set. Again, it's quite theoretical, so not many universities really manage to prepare students, even here in Europe, but also in the US, to really get their first job and really add value right away. It's not very easy, right? Because and then that's where it looks like that's where the college is moving to slowly, is becoming better at preparing people to enter the workforce, because that's the ultimate kind of goal of any educational institution: prepare you for the next step, right? And unfortunately, this is still we'll see what happens in the next few years, but there's a lot of reliance on now online courses or online degrees, right? And people generally take those, and quite often they're more prepared than those who have very generalist education.
I had a really quick question. I was wondering, do you think focusing on ensuring all minority groups have access to opportunities takes away from certain races or groups that might need these opportunities more, such as like Indian Americans are one of the most wealthiest and highly educated immigrant groups in the country. However, like African Americans, obviously we know that like systematically they haven't been given the same opportunities, and it's kind of shown through data and through research that they haven't achieved that level of success yet, that level of economic prosperity as a whole group. So do you think ensuring that all minority groups have opportunities takes away from like African Americans who need these opportunities more because they've been deprived of it for centuries?
I think it's a good point, but sort of I'm also conflicted on this, right? Because are you from the US?
Yes, I am.
And I could tell you that in the US, I think the sort of access to opportunities for any minority group, assuming they're willing to take that opportunity, okay, is much better than in most of the other countries, even in some of the developed countries, right? The way the education system works, and of course, and again, that this comes back to the districts, to the school districts being not adequately funded. That's a kind of ongoing issue. But I think what my observation is also from sort of years of talking to both sort of admission officers and but also school counselors, as well as principals of schools and teachers in schools. A lot of feedback we've had was, look, we actually, even in a very low income communities, they're still trying to identify a handful of students who get access to almost any opportunities you would get in a higher income school, basically district. Yeah. Now the issue that I see is probably deeper, and it starts much earlier, right? And that's, I think it was a good point of removing generational issues, right? Generational poverty. And I think that's where we need to figure out a way to tackle that, right? But to me, I think if you're in the US and you are talking to most of the school districts today, of course there are different levels of resources. Some schools have more counselors, some schools have less counselors. But I don't think you're taking anything away by offering the same opportunities to Indian Americans that you're not off, and sort of you're cutting someone off. I really don't think that's the case, because in the end of the day, with the world becoming very, very connected, with the world becoming more global, with sort of most of the schools have internet connections, and you can get access to a lot of opportunities. More importantly, when it comes to college education, every single minority group is looked at completely differently. The financial aid is allocated completely differently, depending on your income, depending on your kind of family situation, depending on whether you're a first generation or not. There is a lot of thought that's been given to that. And there's a lot of I think that there is a huge, the framework has been put in place to help different ethnic groups, different minorities. It's not perfect. We can argue that it's not perfect, and we can argue for hours about it. But I do think that US is a much better place compared to many others, right? So there's always going to be disconnect. There's always going to be sort of communities that will have more funding than the others. But I think you still have access to quite a lot of opportunities if you're a student and you're in the US and you're willing to put an effort to achieve something. You will get access to those opportunities, irrespective of your background.
Hi, I have a quick question about like an older topic that you talked about, equality of funding to provide equality of opportunity. I was just like thinking out loud, I guess, wouldn't it make more sense to have equitable funding as opposed to equal funding? Because to truly get to like this clean state and this equal level of opportunity, you have to provide more to those who are low income or minorities who are right now at a lower level than the traditional like white man, or schools that are in high income areas or already more funded. And in addition, a lot of funding like doesn't really go to what is needed. Like my school, we are highly funded, but honestly, that funding is not put to what it should be put to. So to truly get this level of equal opportunity, wouldn't it just make more sense to provide more to those who right now have less, to get them to the same level as those who already have more?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, a simple example, if you have a school district that already has 500 laptops, it's quite clear that school district is going to do better in the coming years compared to the school district that doesn't have it, right? So that you need to have the same equipment, the same resources across all the school districts. But once you're there, you should not differentiate between the sort of which is it, is it historically a great school, right? Because that's what's going to happen. That school that was great, if you stop the funding there, it's very likely that the families will move, right? The new generation of students will choose to move to a different school district over time, and that's what happened in some of the cities in the U.S. Actually, you've seen. I mean, there are a couple of examples. I think in New Jersey where you had a very good school system, and somehow sort of they start losing their funding, and the schools sort of the quality of the teaching went down, and the families moved. And so what happened is, as families moved, sort of they moved to a different district. The property prices went up in that district. The quality of school went up in that district, and the quality of sort of this particular district just went down, and it kept going down until it actually reached the point where you ended up having a huge gap between those two counties, those two regions in the same state. So this once you start cutting funding from one place and giving it to another, you're going to have the inequality being created over time, right? It's the same thing that property prices, right? That's something that you typically see, and it's linked to the taxes, right? That we pay. That's also a big factor in anything that we do. We all pay tax, right? And as we pay tax, that funding is being basically allocated to that particular district, right? That particular county. If more higher income families move into that district, you have much higher funding, right? But that funding should be evenly distributed. And if you do that, you should not have an issue with the schooling system. More importantly, it comes back to retention of teachers, right? It comes back to equipment, resources, and all these other things. Because quite often, if you have teachers in one state making double what the teacher makes in another state with the same cost of living, of course the teacher would move to the state where he can make a double, right?
So this kind of jumps off both of the last two questions. You mentioned your organization before and how you guys like focus on education and ensuring people know about like different opportunities and how to access them. Is there, so I guess I'm like kind of like what the previous questions before we were discussing in terms of like addressing these problems from where they stem instead of meeting the problem where it's at currently. Is there like a policy change aspect to it? Because I know like obviously everybody knows, especially in the US, and of course, like as you said before, the US is definitely one of the better countries to be in terms of economic opportunity and otherwise. However, even in the US, we have like huge systemic issues that haven't been addressed, and we see like disparity because of that in almost every state, even one like New York, where of course we have policies that seek to address that in the best way possible. But in terms of like federal policy and whatnot, is there, I guess, what is there, I guess, a portion of this that recommends pushing for policy change in addition to education to kind of both mediate the problem and ensure future generations do not have to face the problem at all? Or is this kind of just meeting the problem as it develops kind of situation?
So there are two things, right? Typically changing the policy and fighting the established government system or sort of educational system or whatever issue you're addressing is very long process, right? It's very lengthy, and it's not something that can be done overnight. But this is the chart. It's a very simple chart. You could see it. There's to me, this is sort of basically, there's a lot of slides there that I'm sure you can download, but this is a very simple chart. So there's basically a correlation between the inventors and their parents' income, right? So what I think we need to be addressing is how do we equalize that? How to make sure that the number of inventions do not or are not correlated with the family's income, right? And I think and then we can talk about some of the very basic things here. And then I think this is quite a couple of very good slides here. And all you need to do is to make sure there is enough resources, and that those resources they come back to a very simple thing. One is teaching resources. The other one is equipment, and the third one is sort of, I would say, safety of the school. To me, this is three things that absolutely must in a school system. If we cannot sort of provide that, then the system is broken. So the policy change, if you want to address, and I know through the socioeconomic lab you address some policy issues here. If you want to really address the policies here, it's very, very simple policy. You need to make sure there are equal resources starting from grade. And this is a very good chart actually, because it tells you that the issue starts very early. It's a third grade math test scores. And so, basically there's a huge correlation between the score in the third grade math class with your ability to innovate. Yeah. So it starts basically, when you're 8, 9 years old. And then, you can also see that the math test scores are highly correlated with the income, right? And as we go, the gap really widens, right? And just to quickly show, why are we talking about this? Because I think if you really want to tackle the policy issue, you really need to start quite early, yeah. And you really need to think about the education system as starting, for kids starting basically at pre-K, yeah. Pre-K is when you really already see the gap widening, yeah. And if you really want to tackle the policy side of this, is you want to start engaging with the local councils, with the local sort of educational boards. Say, look, let's think about school funding and let's think about the quality of teaching here to start with. These are the two things that are very easy to kind of track. And there's two things are very easy to also, I would say, change. Not easy to change, but there are things that could be changed relatively quickly. And to give you an example in that, in a number of countries, when a person graduates from university and wants to go into teaching, you don't get to choose where you teach, because in the US you get to choose, right? You can choose a state or city or district where you're going to get paid more. In other countries, in most of the other countries, especially in developed countries as well, you get sent to a certain district. So if you graduated 4.0 from a good university, and you want to go and teach math, you might end up in a not such a great area. But what it means, the kids in that area are going to have a great teacher, right? It's a simple policy change. Of course, you need to think about New York City. I mean, there is a higher cost of living, so the salaries of the teachers need to be higher as well. So there's got to be some factor for to sort of equalize the salary levels. But I think this is a very, very simple way to tackle the quality of teaching. And the funding is just the easiest thing is to and it starts with funding, right? If you can change the policies to make sure every school district has access to the same amount of funding, and yes, I think the point before is it makes a lot of sense. You need to bring them up to the same level. Okay, so if one school needs extra 500 laptops, you need to get them to that level to make sure that they're on the same level as a school in a sort of neighboring district. But once you've done that, you need to make sure they have the same level of funding. Guys, we have a lot more questions, so let's keep moving.
So I had a quick question. Basically, you were talking about policies and funding, and you were talking about equally funding different schools. But how does that sort of stack up against maybe funding based on incentives? So there was big sort of debate about seeing an increase in GPA year on year in schools, and then sort of allocating funding based on that improvement. So would you think that would be a more feasible system than basically giving equal funding to all schools? Or
Yes. Sorry to be blunt, but I think it's completely stupid, to link it to the increase in GPA. Because in fact, most likely you need to do the opposite, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
You need better teachers and who are willing to take a job in a district where the GPAs are going sort of in the opposite direction. Also, as we know, GPA in one school is not the same as the GPA in the other school. If you find, again, it comes back to the policy, to the person who asked the policy, you should fight that policy, because this is exactly sort of, it's contradictory to how the school should react to our a changing GPA year on year, for example.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I understand you say increase funding, but increasing funding doesn't necessarily increase quality of education. Because, for example, there's several schools that are highly funded who don't have or don't perform better as low funded schools. And providing money doesn't help with scarce resources. For example, like how does providing equal funding compensate for the scarcity of teachers? Because if is there a lottery system, or like
it's very yeah, it was like it's in some countries it is exactly like that the teacher gets sent, irrespective of what of course they will take into account his preferences, but in the first couple of years of your teaching career, right, you get sent to wherever the government tells you to go to, right, wherever the educational sort of ministry tells you to go. So it's very, very simple.
But is that not really fair? Because, for example, like if there's a high performing student who works hard, shouldn't that equate to having better opportunities or having a higher quality teacher who can fully utilize that information versus giving it a chance?
But wait, we're talking about equaling the sort of leveling the playing field, right?
Okay.
So if you already have a very good student, right, in a particular school district, which is already a great school district, fully funded, right? How do you, if you keep allocating more and more funding to that school district, that's great. That's going to be one hell of a kind of school district, and you guys are all going to do well in life. But what happens to 20 other neighboring school districts who don't get that funding? And if you're a good student, right? If you're a good student, it doesn't mean you're going to get sent a bad teacher, right? It just means that you will have the same chance to get the same type of teacher as the school who doesn't at the moment have the same type of funding, right? So I don't, if you really think about, leveling the playing field, you need to sort of stop thinking, okay, I'm such a great student, I deserve to have a better teacher, right? There's got to be an element of equality here, and the only way to do it, I think, is by pushing teachers to go into the district irrespective of historic sort of perception of that district, how good the district was before, how bad it was before. And guess what? They should get paid the same. And on top of that, not only they should get paid the same across the teachers, they should also get paid more, and make sure that, and that again, depending on the country, there are countries where teachers get paid as much as software developers, because that's the issue we have also in a lot of sort of states. In some states, you have very, very high salaries. I mean, you look at Connecticut, you look at Alaska, you look at New Jersey, you have very, very high salaries for teachers. You have states where the salaries are half of that. So if I'm a qualified, if I just finished college with a math degree, and I have I know how to program as well, and I have two options. I'm going to become a software developer. I'm going to become a teacher. It's a no-brainer, right? Because I'm going to make double or triple sometimes, right? So we need to equalize the pay, not only across the teachers and of course account for the cost of living in the particular cities and all that, but also we need to raise the salaries to the point that it makes sense economically for them to choose that profession.
I have a question. Oh, were you done?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So I just have a question to you, Mr. Roundpier. I was wondering, how do you think we can ensure that minorities themselves are in charge of leadership positions for projects that ultimately influence their own communities in terms of innovation? Because a cishet white man perspective seems to be limited in getting insight into the struggles and systemic issues that minorities face, and might not as effectively address the innovation rates as someone who's actually within that group.
And I personally don't pretend to know the answers to sort of to all the questions here, and I don't think it's easy to it's very difficult to generalize across different communities. Yeah, I think the main issue we have at the moment is that in certain communities you need to do much more than the others. Yeah, what I believe is the first thing we need to be doing is we need to equalize the access to those opportunities. So let's put it this way. I mean, the simple way. I mean, if you look at someone who is in middle school or high school, right? There are schools who have 45, 50 different clubs, because I truly believe that you learn as much outside of the classroom as you learn in the classroom. And in certain districts, in very good districts, you have 40, 50 clubs, simply because they have access to content, they have access to sort of teachers who are willing to manage those clubs, whether it's a physics teacher who would oversee the physics club and solve the US physics Olympiad problems on a weekly basis, or it's a sort of a math club, math team, or it's a great debate club. And then there are districts where you have maybe 5 clubs, right? Or 10 clubs at most. that's where you could start quite quickly, right? And yes, I understand that different minority groups need different, sort of approach, but it's very difficult to cater. I mean, it's not scalable. That problem is not scalable if you only cater to certain groups, right? So you need to find a solution that would cater to everyone. Yeah. And in my mind, if you can, for example, on the club side, if you can tackle that problem by introducing more clubs and more content for those clubs, and for those schools, they will definitely learn much more and much quicker. But if you want to cater to a particular community, yes, you need people on the ground. You need people who understand those particular communities, and maybe you need to introduce things that are more relevant to those communities. But that's if you think about the problems and solutions, you want to find scalable solutions. Scalable solutions are the ones that typically you introduce on a federal level, on a national level, and then you insert them into each particular school district. And if you cannot find a scalable solution, then the amount of funding and the amount of time you need to solve the problem will be much, much bigger.
So I had a question about in terms of, like, you made a really interesting point about that system where those teachers get placed in those different districts as opposed to choosing those districts. I was wondering if you think that would maybe discourage people from entering the teaching profession and cause maybe a teacher shortage, because I know in a lot of European countries where they do have that system, they do also suffer from that issue as well. So from your research and your perspective, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
It is an issue, but we already have an issue of shortage of teachers. Now, if you know you're posted in that particular region, and it's very similar to the political ambassador posts, right? You might be posted in a third world country, but you take that risk and you use that as an experience, right? But you have a 2-year post. If you're an ambassador to France, you get to benefit from a great place in Paris and all the cultural benefits of being there, but you also might be posted somewhere else where you might not have the same benefits. It's the same thing with the teaching, right? But if you know you're actually getting paid for that, and there is a sort of an adjustment based on that to your salary, to your economic benefit and career trajectory that could sort of benefit you, I don't think that's an issue. I can give you an example of Germany where I sort of looked, I've spent just the last few weeks talking to both the universities here, but also schools. It's very interesting to see what they've done. I mean, it's only in the beginning of your career where you get posted in different directions. Then you have more flexibility, of course. But the salaries of senior teachers here are really in line, and probably in some cases much higher than those in the commercial sector. So you have an incentive to become a teacher because it also will economically benefit you. Yeah. And you can, I truly believe that, if we are serious as a society to kind of focus on education to educate the next generation of students, we really need to incentivize those who are doing it much better than we are doing it now. You cannot survive in New York City, on a $40,000 a year teaching salary, for example. And that's why a lot of city schools in New York City, that's why a lot of them have shortage of qualified teachers, right? So that to me is one of the issues. And for those, I think, was an example of New York City school. I think that's a great policy to tackle right away.